The morning sun cast long shadows across Jake Martinez's scrapyard when he first heard the sound. It wasn't the usual clang of metal or the distant hum of traffic from the highway. This was different, a low, pulsing vibration that seemed to resonate in his bones. Jake wiped grease from his hands with an old rag and walked toward the source of the noise. At 35, he had spent the better part of 2 decades turning broken machines into working wonders. His reputation as the best engineer in 3 counties wasn't just talk. It was earned through countless nights spent elbow-deep in engines, circuits, and problems that others had given up on. The sound led him to the far corner of his property, where a massive crater had appeared overnight. Steam rose from the earth, and at the center sat something that made Jake's engineering mind struggle to process what he was seeing. The craft was roughly triangular, about the size of a small aircraft, but its surface seemed to shift and shimmer like liquid metal. Sections of it were clearly damaged, with what looked like burn marks scarring its hull. As Jake approached cautiously, a section of the craft's side suddenly became transparent, revealing the interior. Inside, slumped over what appeared to be a control console, was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. She was humanoid, but clearly not human. Her skin had a pale blue tint that caught the morning light, and her hair fell in silvery waves past her shoulders. She wore form-fitting clothing that seemed to be made of the same shifting material as her ship. But what struck Jake most were her eyes, large, expressive, and currently filled with pain as they fluttered open. Their gazes met through the transparent hull, and Jake saw intelligence there, along with something else, hope. The alien girl tried to speak, but no sound came through the barrier between them. Instead, she pressed her hand against the inner surface of the hull, and to Jake's amazement, symbols began appearing where she touched. Jake had always been good with patterns and puzzles. It came with the territory of engineering. As he watched, the symbols shifted and changed, and he began to recognize what she was trying to do. She was attempting to establish some form of communication. He pulled out his smartphone and began sketching the symbols on the screen, then held it up for her to see. Her eyes widened with what looked like surprise and relief. She began creating new symbols, and slowly, painstakingly, they began to establish a basic understanding. Her name was something that translated roughly to, in sounds Jake could pronounce. Her ship was damaged, catastrophically so, and she was stranded. The symbols she showed him next made his blood run cold, images of other ships, clearly hostile and what appeared to be pursuit. Jake understood enough to know that was in danger, and her ship needed repairs that were far beyond anything he had ever attempted. But as he looked at the damaged craft, his engineer's mind began working. Every machine had logic to it, even alien ones. There would be patterns, systems, ways that energy flowed and components connected. The first challenge was getting out of the ship. The hull section that had become transparent seemed to be some kind of emergency feature, but it wasn't opening. Jake spent the next hour studying the exterior of the craft, looking for anything that resembled a manual release or access panel. Finally, he found it, a section near what he assumed was the front of the ship where the hull material seemed different. When he pressed his hand against it, it responded to his touch, becoming warm and then suddenly shifting aside to reveal an opening just large enough for a person. Emerged slowly, clearly weakened by whatever had happened to her ship. Up close, Jake could see that while she was humanoid, there were subtle differences that marked her as alien. Her fingers were longer than human fingers with an extra joint. Her ears came to slight points, and when she breathed, it seemed more controlled, more deliberate than human breathing. She was also beautiful in a way that transcended species, and Jake found himself staring before catching himself and looking away respectfully. Seemed to understand his gesture of politeness, and when he looked back, she was smiling, an expression that translated perfectly across species lines. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like, confirming his earlier guess about her name. Then she pointed to the ship and began what could only be described as the most complex technical explanation Jake had ever been part of. Using a combination of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the symbol system they had established, began showing Jake how her ship worked. The basic principles weren't entirely foreign: energy storage, propulsion systems, navigation computers. But the technology was so advanced that Jake felt like he was a caveman trying to understand a jet engine. The ship's power core was damaged, not just depleted, but actually cracked. The propulsion system had several burned-out components that would need to be completely replaced. The navigation computer was offline, and several other systems that Jake couldn't even identify were showing damage. As the day wore on, Jake brought water and food from his workshop. She accepted the water gratefully, but seemed uncertain about the food, a sandwich, and some fruit. After careful examination and what appeared to be some kind of internal consultation, she tried small bites and seemed to find them acceptable. Communication became easier as they worked together. Was clearly highly intelligent, and she seemed to have a natural gift for adapting her explanations to Jake's level of understanding. She showed him how the ship's hull could become transparent or opaque at will, how the interior could reconfigure itself based on need, and how the control systems responded to both touch and what appeared to be some form of thought interface. The more Jake learned about the ship, the more impressed he became with its design. Every system was interconnected, redundant, and elegant in ways that human engineering was only beginning to approach. But he also began to understand the scope of the damage and the challenge ahead of them. By evening, Jake had a better grasp of what they were dealing with. Ship used technology based on principles that human science was only theoretical about: controlled fusion at the molecular level, gravity manipulation, and computing systems that seemed to operate on quantum principles. But Jake had spent his life taking impossible problems and breaking them down into manageable pieces. As he looked at the damaged craft, he began to see possibilities. Not direct replacements for the alien technology, but human solutions that might serve the same functions. The power core was the biggest challenge. Ship used what appeared to be a controlled fusion reaction contained in a crystalline matrix. The crystal was cracked and indicated that without it, they couldn't generate the power needed for the ship's systems. Jake didn't have access to fusion technology, but he understood power systems. His scrapyard was full of generators, batteries, and electrical components. Maybe he couldn't replicate alien fusion, but he might be able to create a human power solution that could at least get the ship's basic systems running. The propulsion system was another challenge. Ship seemed to manipulate gravity itself for thrust, which was far beyond human capability. But Jake had worked on aircraft engines, rocket motors, and experimental propulsion systems. The principles of thrust and momentum were universal. As the sun set on that first day, Jake realized he was committed to something that would either be the greatest achievement of his life or a spectacular failure. But as he looked at, sitting beside her damaged ship with an expression of hope and trust, he knew he had to try. That night, Jake barely slept. His mind raced with possibilities, calculations, and half-formed ideas about how to bridge the gap between human and alien technology. He made lists of materials he would need, components he could salvage, and modifications he would have to make to his workshop. When morning came, Jake found exactly where he had left her, sitting beside her ship like a guardian. She had somehow made herself a simple bed from materials in his scrapyard, and she looked up at him with those expressive alien eyes as he approached. Jake had made his decision during the long night of planning. He gestured toward his workshop, then pointed to her ship, then made what he hoped was a universal gesture for "let's get to work." His face lit up with understanding and something that looked very much like joy. She stood up, brushed dirt from her strange clothing, and followed Jake toward what would become the most challenging and remarkable engineering project of his life. The workshop that had once seemed spacious now felt cramped as they began moving components and planning the repairs. Watched with fascination as Jake organized his tools and materials, occasionally picking up human implements and examining them with the curiosity of someone seeing familiar concepts expressed in unfamiliar ways. Jake started with the power system. He had several high-capacity batteries that he could wire in series, along with a diesel generator for backup power. It wouldn't be elegant, and it certainly wouldn't be as efficient as alien fusion technology, but it might provide enough energy to get the ship's basic systems online. As he worked, proved to be an invaluable assistant. She seemed to understand his intentions almost before he explained them, and she had an intuitive grasp of how human tools worked. More importantly, she could interface with her ship's systems to monitor their progress and adjust configurations to accommodate the human technology Jake was installing. The first breakthrough came when Jake successfully provided enough power to activate the ship's basic systems. Lights came on throughout the interior, and the transparent sections of the hull began displaying what appeared to be diagnostic information. Let out a sound that could only be described as a cheer, and impulsively hugged Jake. The gesture was so human and so genuine that Jake found himself smiling broader than he had in years. But the celebration was short-lived. As the ship systems came online, they revealed the full extent of the damage. In addition to the power and propulsion problems they already knew about, several other critical systems were either offline or operating at severely reduced capacity. Jake looked at the diagnostic displays, trying to interpret the alien symbols and readouts. Some of it was beginning to make sense to him after a day of working with, but much of it remained mysterious. What wasn't mysterious was reaction to the information. Her expression grew serious, and she began pointing to various displays while speaking in her own language. Jake didn't need to understand the words to recognize urgency. Through their established communication methods, managed to convey that her pursuers, whoever they were, had technology that could track her ship even when it was powered down. With the basic systems now online, that tracking would be more effective. They had bought themselves some time with the repairs, but they had also started a clock counting down to discovery. Jake's hands moved with practiced precision as he worked on the propulsion system modifications. 3 days had passed since they had restored basic power to ship, and every moment felt borrowed. The alien girl worked beside him, her long fingers manipulating components with a dexterity that Jake. The workshop had been transformed into something that looked like a fusion of human engineering and alien technology. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting Jake's improvised power systems to access ports that had shown him how to open on her ship's hull. The air hummed with electricity and possibility. Jake had given up trying to understand exactly how ship manipulated gravity for propulsion. Instead, he focused on what he knew: thrust, momentum, and the basic physics of getting from point A to point B. His solution was characteristically human in its directness. If you can't replicate the elegant alien technology, overwhelm the problem with raw power. He had salvaged 3 jet turbines from aircraft engines in his scrapyard, along with the fuel systems needed to run them. The turbines were designed for different aircraft and had never been meant to work together, but Jake had spent his career making incompatible systems talk to each other. The biggest challenge was mounting the turbines to ship without compromising its structural integrity. The alien hull material was stronger than anything Jake had ever encountered, but it was also unlike anything he had worked with before. Traditional welding and bolting techniques simply didn't apply. Had shown him how the hull could be programmed to form attachment points, but it required interfacing with the ship's computer systems in ways that Jake's human brain couldn't manage directly. So they had developed a workaround would use her thought interface to create the modifications Jake needed, while Jake handled the mechanical aspects of the installation. The process was slow and required constant communication between them. Jake would explain what he needed, would translate that into commands her ship could understand, and together they would implement the changes. It was the most collaborative engineering project Jake had ever been part of. As they worked, Jake learned more about and her situation. Through their improving communication, she managed to convey that she was a scientist, not a soldier. Her ship was a research vessel, and she had been studying something that her people's government wanted to keep secret. When she had refused to abandon her research, they had branded her a traitor and sent hunters after her. The technology Jake was seeing wasn't even military grade by people's standards. It was scientific equipment that just happened to be centuries ahead of human development. The realization made Jake wonder what their actual military technology might be capable of. But it also filled him with a strange pride in human engineering. Yes, ship was more advanced than anything humans had built, but Jake was making it work again using nothing but human ingenuity and determination. He was proving that sometimes the elegant solution wasn't the only solution. On the 4th day, they ran into their first major setback. Jake had successfully mounted 2 of the 3 turbines and was working on integrating their fuel systems when ship suddenly began displaying what could only be warning signals. Red symbols flashed across every transparent surface, and an alien sound that might have been an alarm filled the air. His face went pale, an expression that translated clearly across species lines. She quickly interfaced with the ship's systems, and Jake watched as her expression grew more worried with each passing moment. Through urgent gestures and rapid symbol drawing, conveyed the problem. Her pursuers had found her general location. They were still too far away to pinpoint her exact position, but they were closing in. The ship's current power signature was too distinctive, too obviously alien. They needed to either finish the repairs quickly or shut down all systems and hope the pursuers passed by. Jake looked at the half-completed propulsion installation and made a quick calculation. With the current power set up and only 2 turbines mounted, the ship might be able to achieve limited flight, but it wouldn't be able to reach escape velocity or sustain long-distance travel. They would be caught within hours. But shutting down the systems would mean starting over from the beginning when the threat passed, if it passed. Jake had a feeling that pursuers weren't the type to give up easily. There was a third option, one that Jake's engineering mind had been considering since he first learned about the pursuit. If they couldn't hide the ship's alien nature, maybe they could disguise it as something else entirely. Jake began explaining his idea to, sketching diagrams in the dirt outside the workshop. What if they could modify the ship's power signature to look like human technology? The pursuers were looking for alien energy patterns, not the crude but distinctive signatures of human electrical systems. Looked skeptical at first, but as Jake elaborated on his plan, her expression grew more thoughtful. It was risky. They would have to completely rewire the ship's power distribution system and hope that the human components could handle the load. But it might work. The plan required them to essentially create 2 separate power systems within the ship. The alien systems would run on heavily filtered power that would mask their signatures, while human components would provide the obvious electrical patterns that any scanner would detect. To an outside observer, it would look like a human experimental aircraft with unusually sophisticated electronics. They worked through the night implementing Jake's deception plan. It required rewiring major sections of the ship and installing additional human components that served no purpose other than to create the right kind of electrical noise. Jake felt like he was performing electronic camouflage, hiding an alien warship inside the signature of a human aircraft. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Several times, incompatibilities between human and alien systems caused power surges that could have fried both the ship's computers and Jake himself, but proved to be an excellent partner, anticipating problems and adjusting the alien systems to accommodate Jake's improvised solutions. As dawn broke on the 5th day, they finished the power signature modifications just in time. Monitoring systems detected 3 ships entering Earth's atmosphere, moving in a search pattern that would bring them over Jake's location within hours. Jake watched from inside the workshop as the ships passed overhead. They were completely invisible to human sight, but sensors could track them clearly. The ships moved in formation, scanning methodically for any sign of their quarry. For 30 tense minutes, the alien hunters circled the area around Jake's scrapyard. Several times, Jake was certain they had been discovered, but each time the ships moved on without stopping. Finally, the formation departed, heading toward a different section of the continent. Jake realized he had been holding his breath and let it out in a long sigh of relief. Beside him, looked equally relieved but also impressed. She gestured toward the ship, then toward Jake, and her expression conveyed something that needed no translation. She was amazed that his plan had worked. But their relief was temporary. The hunters would be back, and next time they might be more thorough. Jake needed to finish the repairs and get her ship before that happened. The success of the power signature deception had given Jake confidence in his approach to the propulsion system. If human technology could fool alien sensors, maybe it could also move an alien ship. He returned to work on the turbine installation with renewed energy. The 3rd turbine was the most challenging to mount because of its position on the ship's hull, but Jake had learned to work with the ship's programmable matter. What had seemed impossible a week ago now felt merely difficult. Proved invaluable in fine-tuning the interface between the human propulsion system and her ship's control systems. Her ship's computer could learn to operate Jake's jury-rigged turbines, but it needed to understand their capabilities and limitations first. The testing process was nerve-wracking. Jake had to fire up the turbines while the ship was still on the ground, carefully monitoring thrust levels to avoid damaging his workshop or launching the ship prematurely. The sound was incredible, 3 different jet engines operating in harmony, their combined power channeled through alien technology. Ship lifted slowly off the ground, hovering about 10 feet in the air. The alien hull material rippled and adjusted, automatically compensating for the unconventional thrust vectors of Jake's human propulsion system. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't quiet, but it was working. They spent the next 2 days conducting test flights, gradually pushing the hybrid propulsion system to its limits. Jake had to recalibrate the turbines several times as ship learned to optimize their operation, but with each test, the performance improved. The ship could now achieve sustained flight and even limited atmospheric escape capability. It wasn't as fast or efficient as the original alien propulsion system, but it would allow to leave Earth and find somewhere safe to make permanent repairs. As they conducted the final test flights, Jake found himself feeling conflicted about their success. He was proud of what they had accomplished together. The hybrid ship represented everything he loved about engineering. It was innovative, functional, and proof that seemingly impossible problems could be solved with creativity and determination. But completing the repairs also meant that would be leaving. Over the past week, she had become more than just an engineering partner. Despite the language barrier and the obvious differences between their species, Jake had come to consider her a friend. Through their improving communication, had shared stories about her research, her home world, and her dreams for the future. She was investigating something called quantum consciousness, the idea that awareness itself might be a fundamental force of the universe like gravity or electromagnetism. Her research had implications that her government found threatening. If consciousness was indeed a fundamental force, it meant that intelligent beings throughout the universe might be connected in ways that transcended physical distance or species barriers. It suggested that the walls between different civilizations might be more artificial than real. Jake found himself fascinated by such ideas, even though he only understood fragments of them. But he could see why they might be threatening to those in power. Ideas that brought people together were always dangerous to those who benefited from keeping them apart. On the evening before was planning to depart, she surprised Jake by asking him to take a final flight with her. The ship's life support systems had been modified to accommodate human physiology, and she wanted to share something with him before she left. Jake had never been afraid of flying, but riding in an alien spacecraft was an entirely different experience. The ship's interior reconfigured itself around him, creating a seat that seemed to anticipate his body's needs. The transparent hull sections gave him a complete view of the world outside as they lifted off from his scrapyard. They flew higher than Jake had ever been, eventually breaking through Earth's atmosphere into the darkness of space. The sight of his home planet from orbit was breathtaking, but what showed him next was even more remarkable. She activated one of her research instruments, and suddenly Jake could see things that human eyes were never meant to perceive. Energy patterns flowed around and through Earth like a vast, slow-breathing organism. Similar patterns connected to other worlds, other systems, creating a web of something that spanned the visible universe. Explained through their established communication that this was what her research was about. The patterns were consciousness itself, flowing between all thinking beings throughout the cosmos. Every sentient species added to this vast network, contributing their unique perspective to a universal conversation that had been going on since the first intelligence emerged from primordial chaos. Jake stared at the patterns in wonder, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. It was like looking at the nervous system of the universe itself and realizing that he was part of it. Every human thought, every moment of awareness, contributed to something infinitely larger than individual existence. But the display also showed him something else: dark spaces where the patterns were interrupted or distorted. Indicated that these were areas where civilizations had chosen isolation over connection, fear over wonder. Her pursuers represented one such civilization, one that saw the universal consciousness network as a threat to their control rather than a gift to be shared. As they returned to Earth, Jake understood why research was so important and why she was willing to risk everything for it. She wasn't just a scientist exploring an abstract concept. She was working to heal the universe itself, to restore connections that had been broken by fear and ignorance. The flight back to his scrapyard was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Jake was processing what he had seen and learned, while seemed to be preparing herself for the departure ahead. As they landed, Jake realized that their week together had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had always been good at fixing machines, but now he had been part of something much larger, helping to repair the connections between worlds, between species, between different ways of understanding reality itself. The morning of his departure arrived with an unseasonably warm breeze that rustled through Jake's scrapyard like a whispered farewell. He had spent the night making final adjustments to the hybrid propulsion system, partly because the work needed to be done, but mostly because he wasn't ready to say goodbye. Emerged from her ship as the sun crested the horizon, carrying something Jake had never seen before. It looked like a crystalline device, roughly the size of a smartphone but with surfaces that seemed to bend light in impossible ways. As she approached him, the device pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow that reminded Jake of a heartbeat. She held it out to him with both hands, and when their fingers touched as he accepted it, Jake felt a brief sensation like a gentle electrical current passing between them. The device warmed in his hands, and suddenly the symbols on its surface began shifting into recognizable shapes, English letters, numbers, and diagrams that his human brain could process. Through their established communication methods, began explaining what she was giving him. The device was more than just a gift. It was a piece of technology that would allow Jake to continue the work they had started together. It contained compressed information about alien engineering principles, power systems, and manufacturing techniques that could advance human technology by centuries. But more importantly, it was connected to the universal consciousness network that had shown him during their orbital flight. The device would allow Jake to perceive the energy patterns that connected all thinking beings, and eventually, to communicate with other civilizations that were part of the network. Jake stared at the device in amazement, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was entrusting to him. This wasn't just advanced technology. It was an invitation to join something vast and wonderful that most humans didn't even know existed. Continued her explanation, and Jake gradually understood that he had been chosen for more than just his engineering skills. His willingness to help a stranger, his ability to find solutions when others saw only problems, and his natural curiosity about how things worked had marked him as someone who could handle this responsibility. The device would teach him, gradually and safely, how to integrate alien technology with human engineering. It would guide him toward discoveries that would benefit all humanity while ensuring that the knowledge was used wisely. Most importantly, it would help him identify others like himself, humans who were ready to take the next step in their species' development. As Jake absorbed this information, he realized that hadn't been stranded by accident. Her research had led her to Earth specifically, guided by the consciousness patterns she studied. She had been looking for humans who were ready to join the universal network, and her accident had been a carefully orchestrated first contact. The thought should have made him angry. He had been manipulated, tested without his knowledge. But looking at his earnest expression and remembering everything they had shared over the past week, Jake found he couldn't muster any resentment. If this was a test, it had been one that had enriched his life immeasurably. Seemed to sense his understanding and acceptance. She smiled, that beautiful expression that had been one of the first communications between them, and began preparing for her departure. The ship's systems hummed to life, and Jake could feel the hybrid propulsion system spinning up to operational levels. But before she left, had one more surprise for him. She led him to the ship's cargo bay, which had remained sealed throughout their repairs. As the compartment opened, Jake saw technology that made everything they had worked on seem primitive by comparison. Inside were manufacturing devices that could manipulate matter at the molecular level, power systems that could tap into the quantum vacuum itself, and computing systems that operated on principles Jake couldn't even begin to understand. Explained that these were her research tools, and she was leaving them with him. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. With this technology, he could revolutionize human civilization. Clean, unlimited energy, manufacturing capabilities that could end scarcity, and computing power that could solve problems humanity had never even dreamed of attempting. But's expression grew serious as she explained the responsibilities that came with such power. The technology could only be used to benefit all humanity, never for personal gain or national advantage. It had to be shared gradually, in ways that wouldn't destabilize human society or create new forms of inequality. Most importantly, Jake would need to identify and train others who could help him manage this transition. Humanity's entry into the universal consciousness network had to be a collective decision, not something imposed by individuals or governments. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He was being asked to guide his entire species toward a future he could barely imagine, using technology he didn't fully understand, while keeping it secret from most of the people he was supposed to help. But as he looked at the alien technology and thought about what had shown him of the universal network, Jake realized he had no choice but to accept. The alternative was to leave humanity isolated and ignorant while other civilizations moved forward together. Seemed to understand his internal struggle. She placed her hand on his shoulder and spoke in her own language, but Jake somehow understood the meaning. "You are not alone in this. The network will guide you, and I will return when you are ready." The departure itself was both anticlimactic and profound. Jake watched from outside his workshop as ship lifted silently into the morning sky. The hybrid propulsion system he had installed provided the raw power needed for escape velocity, while her ship's systems managed the elegant transition from atmospheric to space flight. Within minutes, the ship was invisible to the naked eye, just another point of light in the brightening sky. But Jake could feel its presence for much longer, a warm sensation in his mind that gradually faded as traveled beyond the range of their connection. Standing alone in his scrapyard, surrounded by the debris of a week that had changed everything, Jake looked down at the device in his hands. It was still pulsing gently, and as he watched, new symbols began appearing on its surface instructions, he realized, for his first lesson in alien technology. The next few weeks passed in a blur of discovery and adaptation. The device, which Jake began thinking of as the teacher guided him through increasingly complex exercises in alien engineering. It started with simple demonstrations of how to manipulate matter at the molecular level, then progressed to energy systems that operated on principles human physics had never discovered. Jake's workshop became a laboratory for impossible inventions. He built a power cell the size of a coffee cup that could run his entire facility for months. He created manufacturing tools that could assemble complex devices from raw materials with atomic precision. He even constructed a communication system that could send messages instantly across interstellar distances. But the most remarkable changes were happening to Jake himself. As he worked with the alien technology, his understanding of the universe expanded in ways that were almost overwhelming. The teacher was showing him how consciousness itself could influence physical reality, how thought and matter were more closely connected than humans had ever suspected. Through the consciousness network, Jake began to sense other humans who were having similar experiences. They were scattered across the globe: engineers, scientists, artists, and thinkers who were being contacted by various alien civilizations and invited to join the universal community. Jake realized that humanity's first contact with alien intelligence wasn't happening through governments or military organizations. Instead, it was occurring at the individual level, with each person being carefully selected based on their readiness to handle the responsibility. The process was slow and careful, designed to avoid the social upheaval that might result from sudden, dramatic revelations. Instead, humanity was being gradually introduced to a larger universe, one person at a time, until enough humans were aware to make collective decisions about their species' future. As weeks turned into months, Jake began identifying others in his local area who were ready for contact. The teacher helped him recognize the signs: people who thought creatively, who were naturally curious about the universe, and who had the psychological stability to handle paradigm-shifting revelations. His first recruit was Sarah, a young physicist who had been struggling with research that kept producing impossible results. When Jake showed her the alien technology, she understood immediately that her impossible results were actually glimpses of physics principles that human science hadn't discovered yet. The second was Williams, a software engineer who had been developing artificial intelligence programs that seemed to display genuine consciousness. Jake realized that was unconsciously tapping into the universal consciousness network through his work, creating programs that were actually interfaces to alien thought patterns. Together, the three of them began building a larger network of humans who were ready for the next step. They worked carefully, following the guidance of their alien teachers, gradually expanding their circle of awareness while maintaining absolute secrecy from those who weren't ready. Jake's scrapyard became an unofficial headquarters for humanity's transition into galactic civilization. The mundane exterior remained unchanged, but beneath the surface, impossible technologies were being developed and tested. clean fusion reactors the size of car engines, gravity manipulation devices that could revolutionize transportation, and manufacturing systems that could transform Earth's entire economy. But perhaps more importantly, the facility became a training ground for human consciousness expansion. Jake and his team learned to perceive the energy patterns that had shown him, and gradually developed the ability to communicate directly with alien civilizations through thought rather than technology. The first time Jake achieved direct mental contact with an alien intelligence, the experience was overwhelming. It was like suddenly discovering that he had been living in a soundproof room his entire life, and the door had just been opened to reveal a universe full of music. The alien consciousness he contacted was vast, ancient, and filled with a patience that human minds could barely comprehend. It had been watching humanity waiting for the species to develop enough to join the universal community. Through this contact, Jake learned that Earth's isolation was ending, but the process would take generations to complete. Humanity would not be rushed or forced into galactic civilization. Instead, they would be gradually introduced to larger and larger circles of awareness until they were ready to take their place as full members of the Universal Consciousness Network. As Jake reflected on everything that had happened since that morning when he first heard the sound of ship, he realized that his life had become something he never could have imagined. He was no longer just an engineer who fixed broken machines. He was a bridge between worlds, helping to heal the isolation that had kept humanity separate from its cosmic family. The device had given him continued to pulse gently in his hands whenever he held it, a constant reminder of the connection they had forged and the responsibility he had accepted. Through it, he could sometimes sense her presence in the vast network of consciousness that spanned the universe. Jake knew that she would return someday, as she had promised. When she did, she would find a humanity that was ready to join the universal community not as subjects or students, but as equal partners in the cosmic conversation that connected all thinking beings. Until then, Jake had work to do. There were more humans to contact, more technologies to develop, and more bridges to build between the world that was and the world that could be. The future was vast and full of wonders he could barely imagine, but for the first time in his life, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. In his workshop, surrounded by the impossible made mundane, Jake Martinez continued the work that a stranded alien girl had begun when she trusted a human engineer with the most important repair job in the galaxy, fixing the connection between Earth and the stars.